just a minute. We'll start with the short video of Calcutta Management Association.
1958 marked the beginning of an idea to bring about how one views and understands management and its potential for meaningful interaction. This led to the birth of Calcutta Management Association, or CMA, with Sir Jahangir Gandhi, the then Director General of Tata Iron and Steel Company Limited, as the founder president. CMA today is a vibrant organization, as vibrant as the city it is located in. Affiliated to All India Management Association, or IMA, the apex management body in the country, CMA today has a membership base of over 1,000, including nearly 100 corporates. True to its mission and vision to create a platform for the management community where contemporary management ideas can be conceptualized, formulated, developed and practiced, CMA over the years has organized a series of path-breaking meets, workshops, seminars, talks, interactive sessions and exchange programs. We at CMA have taken on the onus of covering a wide area from management education to management practice, with the objective of fostering and developing excellence in management, all to help profit the mind.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the third edition of the leadership series organized by CMA after the and in fact, they could be this subject, then talk.
Amitabh, there's a small audio issue coming. This TV Shinoy here.
Arvind.
Anirban, could you do a quick check?
Sir, it seems Mr. Datta's signal is very weak. It's showing red signal now. So, I don't know. He cannot hear us also at the moment, I understand.
Start.
I think Mr. Dr. Gupta, if you could kindly take over and start off, and I'll just connect with Mr. Gupta.
Yes. Right. Good evening, everyone. It is a huge privilege to have with us today Professor Arvind Panagaria, who is a household name in India as well as in many other parts of the world. We are faced with an unprecedented crisis of proportions not known to the world today. And this crisis is such that simultaneously both people are worried about their health as well as they are worried about their economic well-being. Why well-being? They're worried about economic survival, not just worried about their health. So people are worried about whether they'll be alive and whether they'll still be employed and still have a source of livelihood. Never before in 100 years has the world faced a crisis like this. And this is a crisis both affecting the demand side of the economy as well as the supply side of the economy, which is quite unprecedented. And also, this is a crisis that affects every part of the world at the same time. So this was clearly our generation and those of us who are living through these times probably are gaining more experience than any, several generations before this. At this time, there are two sets of professionals who are in the highest demand. One is life sciences professionals, and the other, of course, is economists. And that's why it's a particular privilege for us to have Professor Panagariya with us tonight. We realize how much in global demand he must be at this point in time. Thank you, sir, for spending the time with us at Calcutta Management Association. Professor Panagariya is Professor of Economics and the Jagdish Bhagwati Professor of Indian Political Economy at Columbia University. From January 2015 to August 2017, he served as the first Vice Chairman of the NITI Aayog, Government of India, holding the rank of a Cabinet Minister. During these years, he also served as India's G20 Sherpa and led the Indian teams that negotiated the G20 communiques during the presidencies of Turkey in 2015, China in 2016, and Germany in 2017. Professor Panagariya is a former chief economist of the Asian Development Bank and was on the faculty of the Department of Economics at the University of Maryland at College Park from 1978 to 2003. During these years, he also worked with the World Bank, IMF, and UNCTAD in various capacities. He holds a PhD degree in economics from Princeton University. Professor Panagariya has authored more than 15 books. His book, India, the Emerging Giant, published in 2008, was listed as a top pick of 2008 by The Economist and described as the definitive book on the Indian economy by Fareed Zakaria of the CNN. The Economist has described his book, Why Growth Matters, which was written with Jagdish Bhagwati, as a manifesto for policymakers and analysts. His most recent books are Free Trade and Prosperity and India Unlimited. Scientific papers by Professor Panagariya have appeared in the top economic journals such as the American Economic Review, Quarterly Journal of Economics, Review of Economic Studies, and International Economic Review, while policy papers by him have appeared in the Foreign Affairs and Foreign Policy. He writes a monthly column, The Times of India, and has guest columns that have appeared in the Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, and India Today. In March 2012, the Government of India honored Professor Panagariya with the Padma Bhushan, the third highest civilian honor the country bestows in any field. So, sir, we are extremely privileged to have you join us tonight. And without much ado, I'd like to hand it over to you for your point of view on how to rebuild the Indian economy. And our topic tonight is rebuilding the Indian economy post-COVID-19. But I think that I can take a little bit of license saying we can't wait for COVID-19 to end. We need to start the job here and now today. And so over to you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Mr. President, Mr. Amitabh Datta, Mr. Joydeep, Datta Gupta, and friends. First of all, my grateful thanks for inviting me to present the lecture today. It is a real privilege, and I'm very, very pleased to be here. What I would do is, in the formal presentation, touch on a few themes and hopefully, more interesting issues we can take up in the Q&A session. So let me first say a few things about, how we have handled COVID itself on the economic side. And then I will come to post-COVID, what should we do? First of all, it is true that as Mr. Datta Gupta just said, that this is something quite unprecedented. It's not a kind of shock that the global economy has ever seen in the past. Normally a shock comes in either from the demand side or it comes from the supply side, and then it sort of spreads through the economy. But this was a shock that came both on demand and supply side simultaneously. And so in this sense also, in the economic science also, therefore, fundamentally, this is a bit of an unprecedented kind of shock. Another feature of it also is that this is really not an economic shock, meaning that the origins of the shock, normally if you think of global financial crisis, Great Depression, the origins are somewhere in the economy, somewhere in the economic policies. But this is one that actually originated in health. And that also means that, pure economics cannot fix the problem. In the end, we also need to conquer the health side of it. So all that we should come to. But first, very quick kind of summary of what I think of how the government actually handled the crisis on the economic side. So first of all, as you all know, better than I, since you are there and I'm not, we went into a lockdown. What was it, around maybe 24th March? And that stayed for a while, and eventually around May, I think May 12th was the speech that the Prime Minister gave after 24th March, where he talked about, beginning to kind of open the economy gradually and piecemeal way, both in geographical sense as well as in the economic sense. Geographically meaning that, we divided into these red, yellow, and green zones, and proceeded along opening the green zones faster than the red zones. Now, the steps that we took on the economic side were mainly, again, following the speech of 24th March. The first set of steps that were taken related to ensuring that everybody has food and shelter. And so that was a relatively smaller package, but I think it was exactly right. So let me just say this up front, that my own view is that the government handled it just right. There may be issues on the side, that we saw coming through on immigrant workers whom we saw, well, several of whom we saw walking hundreds of kilometers back home and so forth. So some hiccups came, but broadly, I think as far as the measures in terms of the economic package are concerned, the government did it just right. In the first time, once you have the lockdown, there can't be an economic activity. And therefore, there's a lot of talk following the actions that took place in the United States and Europe of massive kind of stimulus is given, that India should also do this, 20% of the GDP or something of that order. I think the government was quite wise to basically focus very centrally on ensuring that everybody gets the food. And so, the food ration of about 5 kg, meaning food grain and 1 kg of dal, lentils was added free of charge to all those who were covered by the Food Security Act. A lot of, kitchens were opened up in schools and whatever facilities were available. Shelters were opened up and all. So that was the main kind of action. There were some cash transfers were done also to specific groups, including the farmers and all. But I think by and large, that was the right approach, because once you lock down, the problem arises, how people are, who are particularly migrants and so forth, how are they going to get food? And the government focused on that. Once we began to open up, that I think in May, then the government also came in with a very heavy dose of liberal lending by the banks. And among them, one was about the 3 trillion rupees, 3 lakh crore rupees worth of loans that were opened up for the MSMEs. That I think was a big one, but there were several other smaller components to those. Altogether, now this is, we call it, 20 lakh rupees or 20 trillion rupees worth of package altogether once you add the two packages. Large part of it was in terms of lending. that was made available, how much of it gets used up and so forth is an exposed story that one has to look at. But the reason I say that that this was the right way to do it was that initially, if we had gone in with a very large stimulus on the demand side, it wouldn't have produced any results. If I use the economist jargon, I'd say that the supply curve was almost completely vertical, meaning that, even if you stimulate demand, no supply response could have happened because people simply were not there in the workplace. If people are not there in the workplace, then no matter what you do to demand, you're not going to change the supply. And therefore, demand stimulus at that time would have been premature. And we saw it, in fact, the United States and Europe, large number of European countries went in with very large stimulus packages, but they really didn't quite produce the results, and predictably so. But at the same time, for these richer countries, it was something worthwhile to do, perhaps because they could afford it. In India, our ability to afford these things is limited, and I'll tell you why it is limited. Even without that kind of massive stimulus, massive transfers of the kind that US and the Europeans did, even without that, because economic activity came to a near standstill, or large parts of the economy came to near standstill, your tax revenues went out of the window. And purely on that account, we are going to end up with, even with whatever conservative packages that the government provided, we are going to end up with something like, when we started, the debt to GDP ratio was 72%. It'll end up at 85. Add to that the fact that as the workers begin to return, and they are now returning. Even today there was a report that trains that are coming into Delhi and Mumbai are coming occupied with 100% occupancy. This was not the case in June, but July and August we have seen, according to these reports, these trains that are bringing migrants, largely they're bringing the migrants, and they are completely full, particularly in any of the major cities, Delhi, Mumbai I mentioned, but also to some of the cities in Gujarat, wherever the big destinations exist of the migrant workers. So that's beginning to happen. Now, as that happens, we may need some stimulus at a time when stimulus can actually generate supply response. Once the workers begin to return, and it turns out that there's not enough demand, and therefore the producers are holding back, then demand stimulus may be required. And one can then begin to pay attention to what is happening to inventories, for example. If inventory accumulation is happening more rapidly than it happens in the normal times, that's a sign that demand is falling short, and there will be maybe then need for demand stimulus. Also, and now the second part of this package had to do with, as I said, ensuring that the enterprises, this was the loans, the opening up loans and putting moratorium on loan payments until I think end of November. That moratorium is going to continue. And what is going to happen is that as the economy opens up now, first of all, you did not want the enterprises that were solvent, that were sustainable in the longer run, to go bankrupt because of the cash flow issue. And that's a problem that the second package in May tried to solve. Now, even then, it is inevitable that in this environment where a lot of the small firms have no access whatsoever actually to the banking system, will go under. This is where and many who also have access to bank credit will go under, or certainly because no production activity has happened, no revenues have come in. When they begin to open up, there are wages to be paid to workers, there are perhaps back wages to be paid to some. And so the revenue needs are going to be much larger than they have. They really would be now starting with hardly any revenues, nil revenues. So there is possibility that you will see that many loans will become non-performing. And predictions are that in the public sector banks, perhaps non-performing assets will rise once again to the levels of 13, 14, even 15% of their outstanding loans. That's a very high level of non-performing assets. So the government will have to again come in, particularly for the public sector banks, with recapitalization of these banks. And so for that, it is going to again need vast amounts of funds. So it is a good thing that originally we were conservative. We did not, use up all the powder that we had in the first go, and so we can at least afford it. But even then, mind you, that 85% of debt to GDP I already mentioned. If we have to do a bit more of this, another 3, 4, 5 percentage points, it will not take much time to get to 90%. The debt to GDP ratio rising to 90%. Now that has long-term implications, because on that 90% debt, in the subsequent years, you will have to do the service, meaning debt has to be serviced, meaning interest payment has to be made. And what that, of course, means is that a significantly larger part of the government revenues in the following years is going to get used up in making the interest payments. And that will limit the ability of the government to spend on some of the other items that it needs to spend on. And as it is, the government is always kind of struggling for revenues. So it is going to be a challenge. And obviously, there will have to be some sort of fiscal consolidation have to kick in. So that also means, therefore, that the ability to spend on many programs that the government runs today will shrink. The space, and for India, clearly health is an area where the health spending needs to rise up from its very low level currently. Public health system needs to be built up in a much bigger way than we have it today. Today we hardly have any public health system to mention. So that's going to be. So that's the rough rundown on, or my summary of where we stand. Now, as we try to come out of this, once again, I think the biggest challenge still remains containing the infections. And we are running infections at a very high rate. We are averaging about 60,000, 70,000 cases per day currently. That's a very high rate of new cases coming in. And so clearly the focus has to be there first, because unless we conquer this, we bring these infections down to, a few thousands countrywide, it's going to be tough, to get the economy at full capacity. Even, I can tell you in New York, we were, in terms of the cycle of this COVID, New York was among the early ones. Now we are down to, New York City particularly, these are the numbers I'm following, we're down to about, 250 to 300 cases every day. And the deaths due to COVID have come down to in single digits now. Numbers are in about 3 or 4 deaths a day currently. Even then, we cannot get to business as usual in the entire fall semester, which will run from 8th September to about end of December. My classes will be all online. I will be teaching online. We will have a very small number of, or small proportion of classes that will be hybrid, meaning that there will be some students who would get to go to the class while the rest will be online. But that's about it. Right now you still have to do the social distancing, you have to have the masks, all of which makes it much harder to get to full capacity. So, and in India, I think, vaccine, perhaps we are still a little behind. maybe in the US and Europe, the richer countries, the vaccine might arrive, purely in terms of because of the purchasing power. We may be in this part of the world where I am, perhaps vaccines will become available as soon as they are approved. I think in India we got 1.3 billion people, 1.35 billion people. Even after approvals have happened, manufacturing on that scale will take time. The US particularly has also invested several $billion in advance, basically guaranteed to the potential manufacturers. And so even before approval, some of the manufacturing can happen. I think that is happening much less on the Indian side. The Serum Institute is still doing second stage trials, for example, for the Oxford vaccine. So we are talking for India going into, more or less the next fiscal year, 21-22, when things probably will begin to normalize. That's, I guess, as I said initially, this is a very uncertain virus, how it's going to evolve. And likewise, there is also uncertainty with respect to vaccines. Actually, worldwide, that uncertainty remains. Whatever I have said just now is contingent on the fact that, virus, that these third stage trials succeed, and virus therefore can be given approval by maybe September, October, and so forth. But all that also remains iffy. So there's a huge amount of uncertainty. And when this will happen, we do not know. What I am confident, however, is that we will come out of it. It's at one level, we can say, I think, the president or maybe Mr. Datta Gupta just said, in the last 100 years, we haven't had anything like this, which is probably correct, because AIDS probably was the pandemic that really took most lives, but it was spread over a much longer period of time, and normal life was not disrupted in the way COVID has disrupted. But if we go a little bit beyond 100, then we did have the Spanish flu of 20th century, 1918 to 1920. And that took, in fact, many more lives than, lives that COVID has taken today. Is a tiny fraction of the lives that we lost in the Spanish flu. So, but eventually, actually, in that time, we didn't even have vaccines. But eventually, the virus itself went into remission. So dramatic things can happen. Good, bad dramatic things have happened. Good dramatic things can happen also. If you go beyond that, you had Black Death pandemic of the 14th century, very big. Then you can talk the economic crisis we have had within the last 100 years, the Great Depression. We had the 9/11 in New York and 26/11 in Mumbai, global financial crisis. All of these eventually came out of it. So I have no doubt we will come out of it and we will return to business as usual. So that's where I will quickly kind of take another 10 to 15 minutes and end the lecture. Now, in the longer run, what do we need to do? And here it's good to also see this, what is happening in the China context. We got a major potential enemy on the border, and that is going to be a challenge. And I have argued that, look, today if we were a $10 trillion economy, perhaps China would be a little less aggressive with respect to us. But we are 1/5 of China in terms of size, and that does give it some extra leverage. And so it sort of pushes us around a bit, even though we are not a small economy, as almost all other economies surrounding China are, except Japan. But if we were 10 trillion, I seriously doubt that China would behave in the way it has behaved with us. But that's just one immediate point from our own point of view also. And if we want to bring prosperity to our own people, I don't mean just removal of abject poverty. I think that we are doing, and we have successfully done that. over the last, particularly over the last 20 years, I would say, or about 16, 17 years, when we have grown at 7% plus. If you take the growth rate over the period just prior to COVID, starting from the year 2003, we've grown at about 7.3, 7.4%. So that's a pretty decent growth rate. And that kind of growth rate raises incomes of people, so helps reduce poverty that way. But it also gives government more revenues, which it can then use to carry out social expenditure programs. So we did NREGA, we did Food Security Act, we have done PM Kisan, large number of other social schemes also we have done. So, but that all that goes to fight the abject poverty. What we need is to bring prosperity to people. And here my diagnosis is as follows. I think India's major problem, I think, if one wants to summarize it in one point, is the problem of too many tiny units, too many very, very, very small units, economic units. Look at the farms. Now, almost 42% of the workforce today is in farming. But what kind of farms are these? 70 million, which is about 48% of all agricultural holdings. 70 million or 48% of all agricultural holdings in India today are less than half hectare. And if I look at the average size of these units, each of which is less than half hectare, it is just 0.23 hectare, less than a quarter hectare. Now, on a small, tiny farm like that, you don't have much value added. For these farmers, even if you double their income or even triple it, it's not going to go very far because the base is so low. When you are starting at such a low base, you can double it, you can triple it. It's not going to go very far. It's not going to make them prosperous. It will help them. There's no doubt, that no matter how low, if the income gets doubled, it helps. But it's not going to make them prosperous. If we are talking of serious prosperity, I think we've got to think in terms of moving virtually all farm families that are on these tiny little farms out of farming into more gainful employment. So that's my one kind of example of tiny economic units. Second, come to industry and services. Once again, if I go by the 1718 periodic labor force survey, PLFS, according to it, only 9% of overall workforce, so 42% for 1718, 42% is 1819, 1718, which is where I remember all the figures. 1718 was 44% in farming. Only 9% of the workforce in India, according to 2017-18, was in companies that were more than 20 or more workers. Now, even 20 workers is not a large firm, it's a tiny firm. But it tells you that where all the rest of the workforce is lying. In fact, a very large part of the workforce is self-employed, and they are in these enterprises that we call own account enterprises, where in effect there are no hired workers. So it's only the family labor that is contributing to the productive activity in these own account enterprises. Very large part of the workforce in industry and services is in these self-employment kind of enterprises. And then there are people who are not even enterprises, purely they are self-employed. And if you look at the corporate employment, larger corporations, very, very small, nothing more than 6-7% of the workforce actually is in those kind of enterprises. Now, the problem is that this is all subject to what I call underemployment, both agricultural that I have described and these very small enterprises of industry and services. Underemployment in the sense that their productivity, output per worker is incredibly low. They are doing something. I've always said that India's problem is not unemployment. Press makes much about all this when the 6% figure came out in the PLFS 1718 report. But even 6% by global standards is natural rate of unemployment in most countries. even while people are moving from jobs, shifting, looking for alternative jobs and so forth, they go out of workforce and so forth. So 6% is not a large unemployment rate. What is the problem is the underemployment. They are working, but working in these employments where output per worker is extremely, extremely low. Why is this the case? Well, I've already said it implicitly, which is that India does not have enough medium and large firms. The emphasis in India has been on small, and that has created these very inefficient, very low productivity, nearly unviable kind of units. If you look at the history of any country which has transformed itself in 20 to 30 years, be it South Korea, be it Taiwan, be it Singapore, be it China, any country, or even those who took much longer, the industrial countries, if you want to look at those, they took much longer, they took 100 to 150 years to transform. Ultimately, this happened by moving workers out of this informal employment in large numbers. Now, not everybody has to be in medium and large enterprises, but many, many more have to be than it is today. One set of numbers that will give you some idea is, and since comparable numbers are a little hard to get, these are old numbers, about 2005 numbers. In 2005, China had about 50% of its workforce in manufacturing, 50% in large firms defined as those with 200 or more workers, about another 25% in medium size, which is 50 to 199 workers, and the remaining 25% in less than 50 worker firms, 49 or fewer. In India, in the same year, 84% of the manufacturing workforce was in small enterprises, less than 49 workers, 49 or fewer workers, less than 50 workers. Now, what happens is that when you're dominated so much by the small firms, then the average productivity suffers. When you got this very large number of medium and large firms, they define the ecosystem. Many of the large firms and some of the medium ones operate in the global marketplace, where you got to deliver good quality at good prices, which of course means that productivity has to be high. Without high productivity, you cannot do that. So you have to have high productivity when you operate in the global economy. And that, of course, drives the change. That drives the technological change, that drives the management practices that give you high productivity, that, all things, good things that you need to do to become competitive in the global economy. And when that happens, and a large part of the workforce is here, that tightens the labor market for the smaller firms also. And then the smaller firms also have to shape up, because if smaller firms are going to survive in a very tight labor market where the wages, they have to compete for the workers with these medium and large firms, well, they have to raise their productivity also. So it turns out for that 2005 year, the worker productivity in small firms in China is about 60% of the worker productivity in large firms. In India, the worker productivity in these small firms was only 20% of the worker productivity in the large firms. Now, here you got 84% of the workers in these small firms, and of course they end up with very low productivity. Well, you have a mass of very low very low productivity employment. That is a problem. And that, of course, is all about, that is why the policy, why is it? The ultimate, you have to ask the question, why is it that we are so full of tiny economic units? And that, of course, goes to the policy. There is a full roadmap, what one needs to do on policy front, underlying which, of course, the key factor is that what you need to do is to ensure that our firms begin to capture the global markets. Today, China has, in merchandise trade, meaning goods trade, both industrial and agriculture together, China has a share of about 12 to 13% in the global merchandise exports. And that's 12 or 13% of about $17 trillion. Total global merchandise exports today are about $17 trillion. $70 trillion, not rupees. We got only 1.7% share in that. In the end, that is where the problem is, and that connects back to the absence of medium and large firms. So the whole ecosystem has to transform, and that requires a lot of policy reform. So my latest book, which came out about 3 or 4 months ago, just around the time that COVID was beginning in March, it's called India Unlimited. So I outline a very large number of reforms that India needs to do. We can come to those. I want to stay within our time. So I will not outline that. Maybe anybody is interested, we can talk about that when we come to the Q&A. So let me conclude there. Let me say that the take home on what we need to do long term is the reforms that will allow the emergence of medium and large firm employment in much larger numbers, and therefore allow these employees in the very tiny enterprises to at least partially, some of them move to the larger and medium enterprises, which will then also open the door to the migration of workers out of agriculture, which is also required in much larger numbers. That is what the underlying message is. That's where we need to go. What reforms are required, I have not spelled out, and that's where I refer to my book, India Unlimited. And with that, let me conclude. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Panagariya. You have explained to us very lucidly and completely in layman's language, which we all could understand, the occurrences in the past few months, the actions taken by the government of India, the alternate possibilities and what that could have been right or wrong. And I think everything is a lot clearer to us now than it has been, because all of us tend to theorize and different points of view are floated, but you have brought certain logic, irrefutable logic to the discussion on the obvious steps that needed to be taken, many of which have been taken, and what the challenges are in terms of recovering from the situation. The questions are pouring in, and possibly we'll have many more questions than is feasible within the timeline to respond to. So what I will attempt to do is to consolidate some of those questions and ask them in some kind of an order. I think we'd request your views on a couple of topics to start with. One is, in the context that you mentioned, what is your projection or prediction around the potential inflationary challenges that the economy might face?
Okay, so I'm not worried about inflation right now. I know that inflation is running at 6%. I'm in this, and on monetary policy, I'm not an inflation hawk. My tolerance level is actually that 6-7% inflation is not a bad thing, because in the end the government also needs revenues, and inflation helps that, because we measure revenues in nominal terms. Profits of enterprises, corporations also measure their profits in nominal terms, not in real terms. So, and we can all, we have enough social safety nets there in terms of Food Security Act and so forth, subsidized food to the poor. So we do cover them there. So on the whole, I'm not worried. And the central bank in any case is much more conservative than I am on this. Even the previous governors were, of course, far more conservative compared to the current one. But even the current one, it's the nature of the institution. The Monetary Policy Committee tends to be hawkish on this. So I'm not, I don't worry too much on inflation.
All right. Now, to develop our country, and you pointed out that the headroom is very little for us, unless to keep providing a stimulus and so on. We've already reached a level where, if we keep pushing it, we are basically passing on this burden to future generations to deal with the crisis that we have today. So the headroom is very limited. With this very limited headroom, what could be the future around three topics: infrastructure, healthcare, and education. These are three topics undoubtedly that we need to invest in for economic and social development in the future.
Very
So,
good.
given that we are having to deal with the current crisis, and how would the government find the money to invest in these three things?
Yeah, so very good question. Certainly, you could also add defense to that. I mean, I think defense is also another very important area. And so it is a juggling of of your limited resources. Certainly, budgets will remain tight. Now, if the government really can, scale back some of the programs, it can potentially, swing it okay. Because one of the problems we have is that there are a very large number of schemes that the government runs. There are the centrally sponsored schemes, then there are central sector schemes, and there is never a sunset date on that. They continue. We never assess, whether they are achieving their objectives. So that's one thing that we could try to do, but still, that's on margins that will help you. What I would do is clearly infrastructure and healthcare; those two have to be paid attention to. And infrastructure, particularly, I think, because bringing private sector into infrastructure is a bigger challenge. Healthcare, I would still, I think private sector can be brought in, both in terms of hospitals as well as medical education. See, one of the things we are not, now this government has tried to move faster, is that the medical education has not expanded fast enough, so not enough doctors and health workers. That needs to be, but I think now they are moving now. But there also, one can rely on letting the private medical colleges come in, private institutions in other areas of health, like nursing, etc., come in. On education, I personally think that, the government really should not increase expenditures any further. Such a large volume of the educational expenditures is going into paying salaries to teachers whose productivity as a group is incredibly low. Just one set of figures I give you. Today, at the elementary level, elementary schools, 68%, more than, almost a little more than 2/3 of all elementary schools in public sector, public elementary schools have less than 100 students. Average number of students in these schools is 45. And that is the official data, which tend to be inflated because you're trying to get as much as you can on midday meal ration. And then on any normal day, minimum you can see there's 20% absenteeism. Students are absent, 20% of the students are absent. What that comes down to is a class every day in these 68% of the schools, which has 5 to 7 students on average. That's pedagogically unviable. And per student, you are spending 40,000 rupees on the teacher salary. That is where we stand in public education. What has happened is, if you take 2011 to 2018, 2010-11 to 17-18, 2.3 crore students have migrated out of, meaning, the number of students in public schools has declined by 2.3 crore. And yet we are hiring more teachers. That's a very bad use of taxpayers' money. Progressively, any parent who can afford just a little bit, even 150 rupees per month, they are moving their children out of public into private schools because they are not getting the education that they think will guard the future of their children. Now, there is a dominant school actually in the government, ki nahi bhai, education is the government's responsibility. It has to run the schools. But that's the play with the future of the children. mean, how long do the children of the poor people have to bear the brunt of this thinking that the Sarkar has to provide? Either it has to provide effective education, or it has to let the children go and give them the resources. Today, government employees get some 25 to 27,000 rupees to educate their children wherever they want. The children of the government employees, for them, you give 25 to 27,000 rupees. Give the children of the poor parents at least 5,000 rupees. And I say give it in terms of vouchers, so that they get used only in terms of for education. So I have a very strong view as far as school education particularly is concerned. We got to rely a lot more now, given the productivity that is we are seeing. So I would not, this national education policy, which has a lot of very good features, and on higher education, I think it is extremely good. But on school education, it's when it says, raise the budget in education from 4% of GDP to 6% of GDP, I don't think under the current kind of governance, I would approve of that. So I think it's going to be tight squeeze. There is no doubt in the years to come, because the government will, when debt to GDP rises to 85 to 90%, interest payments will rise quite a bit. The only thing I would say is that, therefore, that's a very important reason to massively accelerate economic reforms that will get you back to 8 to 10% growth rate. With that, your revenues will, if you real terms, if you grow 8 to 10%, in nominal terms, you can grow 14 to 15% a year. That will get your revenues rising much faster. I mean, that has to be the strategy that, do whatever it'll take to accelerate growth.
Now, many global corporations are getting rather concerned that they've put too many eggs in one basket, okay? i.e., maybe a great deal of their supply chain is dependent on a single country, China.
Right, right.
And there is a move to take a relook at their supply chain strategies globally and find alternate supply chain and alternate sources other than too much dependence. I'm mentioning China, but not necessarily China. There is a relook at supply chains. And so in this race of relooking at supply chains, many countries are positioning themselves to be alternate manufacturing destinations. Okay? For example, Vietnam. Okay? Now, you mentioned the challenge that we have in India in that from the farm sector to industry, it's very fragmented, and therefore it is not in a competitive context with a country like China where it's less fragmented. How does India rank vis-a-vis other countries such as Vietnam on this dimension of fragmentation of industry and fragmentation of production and therefore productivity? What does India need to do to become a part of global supply chains?
Right. So I think that's a huge opportunity. That is really the huge opportunity India has right now, that the supply chains are now reconfiguring. And even though you sort of de-emphasize China factor, I think China factor is the one that's driving it. That not only already because of high wages in China, because of the US-China trade war, already multinationals were trying to move out of China. Now, after COVID and so forth, this process has really accelerated. Nobody trusts China anymore. So there's a huge opportunity. But from the actual movement of multinationals to countries like Vietnam, Bangladesh, Thailand, etc., and much less to India, we already know that we are not seen as such a hot destination, which is a pity. I mean, at the end of the day, if you're looking for an alternative to China, who has that kind of workforce, both skilled and unskilled or low skilled? It's India. And yet, why do they hesitate to come here? That's all goes back to the all kinds of inflexibilities that we have in the system, the difficulty of doing business in India, but also things like very inflexible labor markets. Where if you are more than 100 workers, practically the law will not allow you to lay off any workers under any circumstances. That's crazy, for a country like India. I mean, if you look back, China, labor markets were extremely flexible. It's only now that they are beginning to introduce much more regulation in labor markets. Land, we have done the same thing. Land Acquisition Act of 2013. That's an Indira Gandhi era type of law that we enacted. It's a situation. I mean, when you put that with the fact that India has no clearly defined land titles, you are in a situation in which there are numerous encumbrances when you try to buy land from private owners. A lot of pieces of land that you are trying to buy to collect a larger piece of 50 acre or 100 acre of land. You get into these pieces of land where, because of the encumbrances, you don't know who the owner is, from whom to buy. So that's where the land acquisition by the government becomes extremely important. The government has to then acquire that land for the industry. But you can't do that under the, practically it makes it impossible, the current Land Acquisition Act. So your land markets are inflexible, your labor markets are inflexible. Currently, unfortunately, we also have difficulties in the financial markets. Now, that's of a recent origin. I mean, I think we did not go to the cleaning of the non-performing assets early enough. I mean, the problem to me was clear by the end of 2013, but we did not start cleaning up till early 2017, till mid 2017. So NPAs were high, and then we got hit by COVID. So even before we went into COVID, the financial sector stress was so large, which I think was a principal reason growth during 1920 ended up only 4.2%. So we already went into COVID with a weak kind of financial sector, and it will be further weakened as we, eventually come out of COVID. So it will be this weakness in the financial sector, the mistake we made of not cleaning it up on time, is going to haunt us for a while. But those are the things that need to be addressed. And I mean, the financial sector, I can see that, now from where we are trying to do what can be done. The government is vigilant, but labor and land markets, we are not doing almost anything. I mean, the proposal I have given, what I suggest is follow the Shenzhen kind of model. You look at Shenzhen, 1980, Shenzhen was a group of small fishing villages with a combined population of about 300,000. Today, Shenzhen has about 12 to 13 million people, per capita income of about $25,000 to $30,000, and it is one of the most urbanized spots on the face of the earth. We ought to also exploit our coastal region. What I would have suggested is, something what I call the autonomous employment zones. What you do is take 300 square kilometer or larger area, declare it to be autonomous employment zone, and then give full powers to the local administration on labor laws, on land laws, and so forth within that limited 300 to 500 square kilometers, so that the whole system, and also allow goods exports and imports to move in and out of the zone very flexibly. Remove all the, I mean, all the good things you should do countrywide, but you are not able to do countrywide. Just do these in these autonomous employment zones. And I say, you start with 5 or 6 of these and put about 3 of them on the coast. So you got Gujarat, very good, deep dredge ports you got there. Maharashtra is another state with deep dredge ports. Andhra is another. Odisha is another. So you got these, coastal regions. Create those zones, and people will migrate. You see, people will come just as they did in Shenzhen. So we have to create our own Shenzhens. That is the faster way to do it. And then all the multinationals that want to come can also locate themselves in those zones.
Professor Panagariya, thank you so much. We, it would be unfair to, you've already been so generous with your time, and I know how very busy you are. There are 1,000 questions we'd like to ask you, and we wish this interaction and this, I will say it's like a master class. It could continue for hours and hours and days and so on, but for, I guess, To avail of that, we need to register and perhaps be accepted into Columbia University, right? So I would request TVS Shenoy, our Vice President of Calcutta Management Association, to give his concluding remarks and his vote of thanks. From my side, thank you so much, sir.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Datta Gupta and Dr. Arvind Panagaria. Thank you. What a fascinating session it was. And as Mr. Datta Gupta said, a masterclass in the making. You know, once as I was listening to you, I had a deep regret that instead of doing my engineering, I should have stepped into Columbia University and then a bit of economics. It was economics made simple, concepts so lucidly explained. I think it was for all the listeners here, we had one of the highest listeners in the session for all the sessions which we had, and the questions pouring in shows a lot about about the session which we had. I take two things away, and we represent from the CMA a team of entrepreneurs, corporates, SMEs, students, teachers, faculty. You got a huge gamut of 1,000+ people around here. But two things which really resonated, Dr. Panagariya, at the point which you said about the farm families. I'm recounting my days when I was heading one of the agrico business at Tata Steel. Every year, when we wanted to increase farm mechanization, and when we used to go to meet a farmer, he would have had 2 kids and the land would have divided. And every generation, which used to keep seeing, and it was with so much of despair when we had to get mechanized equipments, it was just couldn't make it possible because land was just, as I said, 0.25 hectares. Where could you do a mechanization? Yeah. So that's we thought from the industry perspective. There is a way which we could perhaps do consolidation, do rental models of doing all that part of it. I think that's still a great opportunity for India. And that's a model which I guess the corporates can catch up with. That really resonated in the way which you explained. Beautiful thought. I hope this can translate into an opportunity for the business, for all the mechanized players. The other point which I thought was very useful was when you described the worker productivity, the medium and large enterprise chasing the small, both in terms of bringing in more productivity. And as we speak, the move away China policy, sensing global recast of the supply chain, we are getting traction in India where global companies outside trying to move with us. I guess this is where we in the corporate, as well as backed up with the government, something could do. And I think this is the moment when they say you never waste a crisis. And I guess the industry will stand up. And maybe 1 year down the line, we would have seen some headway being made there. I leave all the readers with the quote from Dr. Arvind Panagaria's latest book, India Unlimited, Reclaiming the Lost Glory. And this is what Dr. Arvind says. India's present pursuit of prosperity is not an exclusion into the unknown. Instead, it's a quest to reclaim its lost glory. Thank you, Dr. Panagariya, with his wonderful words. I'm sure all our listeners have benefited immensely. And we look forward to perhaps another session a year down the line when we would have seen when the rubber hits the road, we would have done some more pride for us in India. Thank you very much. And good evening and good night, everyone, wherever you all are. Thank you again, Doctor.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Shenoy. Thank you, Mr. Datta Gupta. Thank you.
Thank you.
With that, we conclude the session. Thank you very much.